Well, let's go back a little bit historically. I can tell you about a port city. It was a relatively small city that was rife with corruption. It was one of these places that was an entrepot, and therefore there was trade, there was investment, but there was drug running, smuggling, prostitution rings, all sorts of organized crime was flourishing in this place called Singapore in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, Singapore's per capita income in those days looked like Africa today. And now we know Singapore now has a higher per capita income adjusted for purchasing power parity than the United States of America, and is growing as fast as China. So if China grows at the same pace it's growing now, and so-called West grows at the same pace, by 2050 China will have 1/3 the per capita income of the Western countries. Singapore's already passed because it's been able to capitalize on all the good Chinese cultural traits and all of that sort of thing, but with clean, honest government. Hong Kong is another success story in the region, but I'd like to go to a place called Naga City, the Philippines, where we have a nice case study of Naga City. One of the ministers now of the Philippines government, Jess Robredo, was the mayor, who used principles that you'll find in a book called Corrupt Cities, which are basically principles of systemic reform. Not just going after a few big fish, which you do have to do early on to set the tone that impunity is not allowed, but going after systemic reforms that reduce monopoly power over goods and services, that clarify and limit discretion of government officials by making things clear what the rules of the game are, and by enhancing transparency in a variety of ways. And we can see those principles at work in cities and local governments around the world that have been able to reduce, although never eliminate, corruption. Well, I have seen a few cases where you have civil society coming in from below and doing a number. But yes, you're right, the success stories often have, or usually have, a very strong and honest and capable leader who understands that over the medium term you cannot have rampant corruption, particularly in those important institutions of government, and have success. And so it does take convicted leaders, but I'm also very impressed by the power of civil society right now to make changes. I mean, if we've learned anything in the last year from Tunisia, from Egypt, and now from IPayToBribe.com in India, which has been copied in the last week in China, officially permitted in China, is a site that has the name in Chinese for IPayToBribe.com, which are ways for civil society to report instances of corruption and then each other investigate instead of waiting for the government to investigate. So people show up with smartphones and take pictures of customs officials taking bribes, or they take pictures of traffic cops insisting upon extorting payments. Or they go to the hospital and when someone asks you for money just to get the medicine you need, they nail you with the cell phone or whatever. And so these sites are starting to coagulate these cases of corruption, and the governments are watching. One government in India, a local government in Bangalore, is tracking, the transportation department is tracking the corruption using IPayToBribe.com's indices. So the potential now for crowdsourcing the information about corruption, and I hope in another year or two we'll see people getting together and saying, here's how we can make the system better. Because we can find where the weaknesses are, and both business and citizens can come together and say, look, we're going to start watching this now, and the system may auto-correct without waiting for the hero from on top to push all the right buttons. Well, one of the big problems that mayors have and local actors have is a feeling of impotence and cynicism. They sit back and they say, you know, you really can't do anything in X country because the wages are low, our culture favors it, it's a way of life, and there's political forces and yada yada. And then you say to them, well, here in Nicaragua or in the Philippines or someplace else, are there examples of some cities that have turned things around in the last 50? Are there examples of well-run towns and cities? Yes, oh yes, over here, this one. It's good. Cali, very nice city. I see. And are there some ministries that are run better than others? Yes, this one over here is run. But they have the same culture, the same pay scales, the same this. So what's up? Why don't we celebrate the successes we've had here? I was involved in a very inspiring case in Mindanao with 7 mayors of Mindanao about, maybe 8 or 9 years ago now, where they had identified, the local government and the Asia Foundation identified reformist mayors And they came to spend 5 days with their teams, with me and a few other people at the RAND Corporation, a think tank in California. And they devised strategies of reform, not just about corruption, and shared them with each other. And part of the deal was that we would meet again in 1 year in the Philippines and share progress. We met again, and my presence was simply as convener. I had to do nothing. They sat there and talked to each other. Is that what worked for you? Oh, how did you do that? Oh, it didn't work for me. Oh, it's interesting. And they shared these stories of reform, which to me were very inspiring, but in terms of having to do anything with my magic wand or lead the symphony, I didn't have to do a thing. They had used the occasion to bolster each other. And I think that's a lesson for us, that if we can celebrate, first of all, get a strategic focus, overcome the defeatism, understand some principles, see where the spaces are, come up with some strategies. They're not going to be revolutions. They're going to be, over the next few years, what can we do? And then keep meeting with each other to see, well, let's see, and learn from each other and inspire each other to do better. Well, the democracy's got that weakness that, especially the transition to democracy from authoritarian governments is often accompanied by, especially if there are big natural resources, by more corruption. The electoral campaigns themselves become opportunities for corruption, party financing, vote buying, and expenditures which are designed primarily for populist reasons, not for investment reasons. This has been well documented. And then you say, well, but is that as bad as the dictator? And I guess if you have a very nice dictator who's virtuous and kind, humble and efficient, that's a good thing. As I look around Latin America, Africa, most parts of Asia, I don't see many of those guys around. So we can't count on the theoretical virtues of the uncorrupted monopolistic system. And therefore most countries and their people, from the bottom up, demand accountability that is partly brought by electoral competition and partly brought by these new ways of monitoring that competition and the role of government itself. So I guess I think that, getting back to your question about Thailand, I'm not an expert on Thailand, I don't want to comment on that election, but I have no doubt that if it's like other countries, the election process itself is full of potential corruption. And we have to make sure that the vote counting at least, is very, very clean. And then the financing is the next challenge, which we haven't licked even in some of the most advanced countries. Well, it's a grave problem. About 20 years ago, I wrote a paper called Incentive Myopia, which said we've emphasized the role of incentives in the private sector, but we've somehow forgotten in the development community about the importance of incentives in the public sector. And when I say incentives, it's not just pay levels, it's the incentives at the margin for good and bad behavior. So if penalties are weak for bad behavior, such as all you do after stealing $1 million is lose your job, and if promotions are based on seniority and there's not enough real pay there to live a good life at, you're just inviting, in fact, one economist has called it capitulation wages. You're forcing people to capitulate to bribery. That said, the most corrupt people in the poor countries are not poor people, they're rich people. And so merely having more money does not by any means guarantee probity. And the secret of the Singapore combination was excellent pay with levels of scrutiny and oversight and burden of proof that would astonish some of the more liberal Western countries. For example, in the early days in Singapore, there were, I don't know if this still goes on, but the government officials were monitored so closely there were spies at racetracks and nightclubs looking out for senior government officials. If you purchased a motor car, this was reported to the relevant officials in the CPIB, so that lifestyles were checked, behavior was scrutinized, and therefore you had negative reinforcement of bad behavior at the same time that you had such a large pay that nobody wanted to lose that job. So I think that, getting back to your point about if you've got a huge teacher corps, what do you do to, and if you've got a huge bloated government civil service, which many governments do, how do you cut it back and still get enough incentives in there? My strategy is look for the top 150 officials and make sure they're very well paid, but that's quite elitist. And you've got to have a lot of political space and willpower to be able to jam that through, particularly in times of crisis. But you've got to have those very technically important jobs with big multiplier effects in the economy. You've got to have them filled with very good people. And unfortunately, many governments pay so poorly, they end up with low-level talent, which has two consequences. One is possible corruption, but the other is tremendous inefficiency in extremely important agencies, such as your credit, your property rights, and your banking system and your justice system. If you've got a lot of idiots there all the way through, it's just a tremendous break on your country.